I want to talk today about epic poetry. I want to pick up just before Karina began. She started with Dante. So we talked about, she was talking about epic, something that's really big, how the word is used nowadays as a slang term to mean something terrific. And very often commonly applied to films. You know, there's such and such as an epic film. And it occurred to me too that in a way, those of you who've ever read Tolkien and the Hobbit and the major work the big work of Tolkien, are also reading an epic. I thought it was an epic when I read it. It's not in verse, but it's a mighty work and covers huge themes about the nature of the world, about the nature of good and evil. What's the title of the three books together?
Lord of the Rings.
The Lord of the Rings, of course, sorry, yes, that's right. Then there's the Silmarillion and the Hobbit. This is sort of a short introduction. I read the Lord of the Rings myself, probably over a summer, in just a few days, I think 50 years ago, and I've never read it since. I keep thinking I will read it again, but sometimes there's something is so wonderful that you don't want to, you can't repeat the experience, and I got tremendous pleasure from the Lord of the Rings. Has anybody read it? Anybody else? I'm sure a lot of you have. Yeah.
And the films are also extremely good.
I think so too.
They keep very close to the.
Yeah.
But the Hobbit is a different fish altogether. As a film, made in American or made through an American company, tied it into 3 or 4 parts.
Yes.
And the story was elongated so much you simply lost it.
Yes. Yes.
In my opinion.
Did it? Yes, no, I didn't see that. And I've only seen some of the films made in New Zealand, but I thought they were super. And I'd cheerfully sit down and see the same thing. And I have now downloaded Lord of the Rings to my Kindle, because I read everything on Kindle nowadays. And but I haven't started it. I'm putting it off. And at my age, you don't want to put things off too long. Never know what's going to happen. Anyway, I think that's another epic, really. And I think somehow some of the great science fiction works have something like, for example, C.S. Lewis's trilogy about Venus and space. I think that's got something of the quality of an epic about it too, because it deals with major themes, really big, powerful topics, and deals with them at length, and also takes one into a bit of a fantasy world. Fantasy often seems to be part of the nature of the epic poem, the epic story, doesn't it? Quite usually, quite normally a part. Anyway, the first epics were in verse, and there's a very good reason for that. Can anybody think why they would be in verse rather than in prose?
Easy to remember.
Yes.
People chanting.
Easy to remember in a pre-literate society.
Yeah.
So they arise as stories told around the campfire, as it were, told by poets and composers and rhapsodes. They were called. They were called rhapsodes because they carried a rod which they would beat. We called a rhapsody, which they would beat the time to as they recited the poem. And the modern word rhapsody is quite a completely different meaning, isn't it? But a rhapsode was something with, depending on a regular verse meter. So yes, they were first recorded or remembered in meter because of the need to memorize and pass information on in a pre-literate society. That was the story of it all. And verse, therefore, was used not just for relating fantastic stories, in other words, epic stories, but it was also used for instruction. So a bloke called Hesiod wrote a work called The Works and Days, which was a sort of an agricultural handbook. And that's a very early Greek work, dating from the 6th century BC, in meter, talking about the art of agriculture, the arts of agriculture. Hesiod, Hesiod. And the first of these epic writers that we know about was, of course, Homer, who wrote two major works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, I just made a mistake. I said he wrote them. He did nothing of the sort. He composed them. And he may not even have existed. And, skeptics, particularly in the 19th century, people were prone to skepticism, and they said, well, Shakespeare didn't really write the Shakespeare plays. It was actually Francis Bacon, or it was somebody else. It wasn't Shakespeare. And then they got on to biblical analysis, and they said, well, really, the Bible is compiled from hearsay by a number of different writers. It wasn't such and such a book wasn't written by St. Paul, but by somebody else with the same name, which has a certain resonance in this company today. Analysing text, trying to work out who wrote what, trying to differentiate from one text and another, trying to find differences within the text. It was a great game in the 19th century, and I think we're swinging away from that again, and we're going back to believe that perhaps the tradition was correct. Does anybody here remember hearing of an Anglican bishop called John Robinson, who wrote a book called Honest to God in the early 60s? Does anybody remember hearing about Honest to God? Yeah. It was a very fashionable, anti-orthodox, modernist Christian analysis of Scripture. And he was saying things like, God is not up there, this is a silly view to have of God, that God's above somewhere. And he was saying God is within us, God is everywhere, all those things that we all knew and really didn't need pointing out. But it was such a popular book that I suppose it means that a lot of people did literally think that they were expected to believe in a God who was up there somewhere, who was so many thousand meters above us. I don't know. But certainly it was a bestseller in the 60s. And traditional Christians regarded it with suspicion and disfavour. Anyway, years later, John Robinson became a quite conservative biblical critic, and finally he came to believe that the order of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, was exactly correct, that they had been written in that order. Up till that time, people had been saying, one was written somewhere else, and all the dates were wrong, and they were in a different order, and they were compiled in different ways, and they were collections of different texts. And he came from a position of radicalism to believing that the traditional order was correct. Tradition had been right, he thought, after all, and all our cleverness and all our analysis of textual analysis has been shown to be false. Most biblical scholars nowadays say, for example, that the Epistle to the Hebrews was not written by St. Paul, but by somebody else. I think that's generally agreed, even by Catholics. But I've got a feeling even the Catholic Church still officially talks about St. Paul's Epistle to the Hebrews. I'm not sure about that one. I think they might. But certainly Romans is often, the authorship of Romans is often questioned by the Catholic Church, by Protestant Christians, that it's written by somebody other than St. Paul. But the Catholic Church insists that it was by St. Paul. Who knows? We won't know till we reach the end of, till we come to the beginning of the next life, I suppose. But just to finish my little anecdote about John Robinson, not only did he become a conservative on textual matters, but he became the chairman of the World Committee for the Shroud of Turin. Do you know what the Shroud of Turin is? It's one of those sort of... I would think of it as a genuine miracle. It's certainly the cloth in which Christ's body was wrapped after the crucifixion. John Robinson, the funny old radical modernist Anglican bishop, remained an Anglican, but he became the head of the chairman of the International Committee for the advancement of the good name of the Shroud of Turin. That's where he stayed. He died a few years ago now, but that was his final place, and he did videos on it. And I think it's a wonderful thing that such things can happen. Anyway, I better return to the question of epic, which is the main point of our first half of our day. The first epics, therefore, were composed in metre, in the head, and the Iliad is an account of an event in the Trojan War, the mythology of the Trojan War, a war which may perhaps have happened, and which modern scholars like to argue about, which has clearly been distorted in the telling of the story, as it's been sort of formally recorded and been adjusted in the passage of the years. The metre he chose to write it in was a metre called the dactylic hexameter, and this became what we call the epic metre, the standard epic metre. And it has this funny rhythm that sounds like a dum da da 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 dum 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 da da dum. Think of strawberry, 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 strawberry jam pot. And it's a lovely metre because it's very good for action.
How many strawberries?
Six strawberries. Well, 5 strawberries in a jam pot. It's in. I've got it here set out on page 18 in our book. It's my sort of starting point today. Page 18. In fact, let's go there at this point. Ezra Pound, the poet, says, classic is classic, not because it conforms to certain structural rule or fits certain definitions, of which its author had probably never heard. It's a classic because of a certain eternal and irrepressible freshness. I think that's a very nice summary of what it means to talk about a classic. And then I've shown you the metre here. It's 17 syllables, isn't it? My son's read 17 syllables. But there's a little trick to it, which we don't need to know, but I'm just pointing it out in passing. That each pair of short syllables, which are indicated by the U, each pair can be replaced with one long syllable, which means that the length of the line can vary from 17 syllables down to 30. And the effect of that is that the dum da da dum da da dum da rhythm is temporarily put to one side, so that the 13 syllable line has a heavier style to it. And it means that the poetry has a much greater variety. It's not tedious, it just doesn't go on going dum da da dum da da dum da ad infinitum, but it varies. You can get dum 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 dum, to at the other extreme. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I hope it does anyway. You get the same thing in English, don't you?
Well, you get it in music too.
You get it in music, exactly. It is in fact something best understood by musicians.
Yeah.
That the Greek poetry was based on long and short syllables, like whole notes and half notes,
Yeah.
tones and semitones. That was the sort of, no, sorry, not tones, quavers and semiquavers.
Indeed, you've got a crotchet and a pair of quavers.
Yeah, that's it.
That.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And but those 2 quavers can be replaced by a crotchet
Yeah.
in certain circumstances, so that you get a sort of variety and not a. You've got now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by the son of York. There's an English example, and then you've got Tennyson saying break, break, break on thy cold grey stones, O sea, which is a really heavy. We would call it a spondaic line. It's all long stressed syllables rather than a tripping measure. It's got a solid measure to it. Here's the yes.
Was this combination of the 17 syllables and the 13 syllables whether combined, as in doing some of it as 17 syllables and then changing
Yes.
the next line or so?
Yes, absolutely.
Short, long,
Yeah.
to make it the 13.
Yes, indeed, it was. Yeah, and you could get the lines next to each other. One very tripping and short, and one long and heavy. And you could also get, if you changed two of those short syllables into one long, you didn't have to do it in every metron, in every measure. You could do it just once or twice in a line. So the variation was between 13 and 17, 13, 14, 15, 16 or 17 syllables in each line. But always only 6 stresses to the line. Okay, so and here's the first line of the Odyssey actually. Andromo endipe musa polutron hosmalopola. Andromo endipe musa polutron hosmalopola. And you could hear that very distinctly, that dum-da-da-dum-da-da-dum-da-da sort of moving through. And I've got somewhere else, I've got geometry down a little bit, but on the next page, middle of the next page, I've got some examples of the same thing. You don't need to understand them. I mean, that's just to illustrate the music. 4 examples from Virgil in Latin, because Virgil followed the Greek meter. You've got the first one is a fabulous one. It's about the hoof of the beating the ground in 4-footed measure, talking about a horse galloping across the field. Quadrupedante putrem solitur quae lunga da campo. And that's a purely dactylic line. And then you've got the next one, which has elisions in it. That's so certain syllables are dropped out. And it reads, Tect August ingens centum sublime columnis. Tect August ingens centum sublime columnis. A huge and distinguished building supported by 100 columns. And that's a really heavy line. Can you hear the weight of that? Tect August ingens centum sublime columnis. The next one goes back to the dactyls again. It goes back to the tripping measure. Ut fugiunt aquilas timidissime turba columbae. Ut fugiunt aquilas timidissime turba columbae. So just like the little timid flock of doves flee before eagles, run away before eagles, fly away before eagles. And then the last one is about seals spreading themselves out on the shore. And what's he want for this? He wants a heavy, slow rhythm for this, because seals are big fat creatures and they're lying stretched out on the shore. So he says, Sternum se sono diversae litterae focae. So a much heavier kind of line. Anyway, leaving that, we'll come back to that later on. But let's go back to the Iliad and to the nature of the epic poems. So these, the Iliad and the Odyssey, who's read them? Or some of them? Quite a number of you, right, okay. And you will have read them in a prose translation, probably, would that be right? And one maybe the Penguin Classics, the E.V. Roe translation, or something of that sort. Can anybody remember the translations you've read? Yeah. There are verse ones. I think Dryden translated some of Virgil, and I think he might have done verse translations of Homer too, or Pope. Am I thinking of Pope? Chapman, of course. Chapman is, sorry.
The recent one was by Robert Fables.
Was really?
Yeah.
And is it a prose translation, or is it a 10th verse?
Yeah, it's a pretty accessible prose.
Is it really? Yeah. Speaking of translations, by the way, yesterday with Dante, did you notice who the translator was?
Yes. Clive James.
Clive James, yeah. His last sort of masterwork before he... Is he dead now?
Yes.
Yeah, dead, he's gone, isn't he? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the last thing he did was to translate Dante and the whole of the Divine Comedy. But these are big books. When I say books, they're big collections. The Iliad consists of 24 books. Now, by books we mean scrolls, because there's a limit to the amount you can put on a scroll. So the scrolls tend to be the equivalent of 20 or 30 pages in a modern printed book. So the Iliad is 24 of these books. The combined total, therefore, is something like, let me do a quick sum in my head, about 14 or 15,000 lines. So the Iliad is about the same size as the Divine Comedy. Is that right? I think that's right. I don't count now, I'm not a mathematician as you don't know. And the Odyssey is the same. It's a collection of about 24 of 24 volumes or 24 scrolls, we call them books, 24 books, comprising a huge epic story about the wanderings of Odysseus after the Trojan War. The Trojan War, what's the big deal with the Trojan War? Well, possibly it's just that it's just a coincidence.